Hello and welcome to Calm the Farm podcast, where pharmacy business meets legal wisdom, minus the headache. In each episode, we share practical legal tips and real-life examples to help you run your pharmacy with confidence. I'm your host, Sarah Stoddart. Thanks very much for joining us. A month or so ago, we looked at exercising lease options, and I thought there might be some benefit in exploring leases in a little bit more detail. So, on today's episode of Calm the Farm, I'm talking about whether or not a landlord can force a rent increase and how, as a business owner, you can potentially fight unfair lease hikes. So this is an interesting one, and obviously in a cost of living crisis and when everyone is of course feeling the pinch, particularly in business and life in general, it is important to know where you stand in terms of your rent obligations for your business premises. Now, of course, the starting point is your lease. So before going any further in discussing rent or rent obligations, it is important to dig your lease out and have a look at that. Also important is to make sure of two things. One, that it is the signed lease, the one that was actually signed by the parties, or if that is not available, making sure it is the final version of the lease, to make sure that it is actually what was agreed. Now, if you don't have any luck in finding your lease, I do recommend you chat to your lawyer, as they might be able to conduct a search for the lease on title, or to contact the landlord and obtain a copy. But you really should have a copy of your signed lease. So that's your starting point. Dig your lease out. Now, in your lease, you will, of course, have the term of the lease and the rent that applies. Now, the rent figure that you see in the lease will usually be the rent for the first year. There will then be rent provisions which deal with how the rent is to be increased over time. So it might be that for every year on the anniversary of the commencement date, rent is reviewed, and it will usually be reviewed in one of a few ways. It might be a fixed increase to the rent, which is by a percentage. So it might be that every year, for example, rent increases by 3%. It may be that rent increases by CPI, in which case you need to do a little bit of digging to work out what the CPI for the relevant period is, and that will be the rent increase. Or it might be that rent is reviewed to the market rent for the premises. So that is how rent is typically increased, unless, of course, there's some other arrangement. But those are the three common ways. Now, usually on each anniversary, it just happens and your landlord would write to you with what the new rent amount is. Now, that is fairly straightforward to calculate if you have a fixed increase or CPI, but it is a bit trickier if you're doing market rent. So that is what happens usually throughout the term of your lease. Now, in recent times, we have had a few clients come to us where the landlord has, for whatever reason, forgotten or overlooked the need for rent to increase at a particular date, being the anniversary of the commencement date. And they come back months or, in some cases, years later to advise, oh, sorry, we forgot to apply the rent increase on that particular date. Now, the question that I am asked is whether a landlord can do that. And although the lease is your key document, it is always important to consult the terms of your lease and get advice on that. Typically and usually, yes, a landlord can do that. So usually a lease will provide that they can apply the rent increase at any time after that particular date, and a failure to do it doesn't actually waive their right to do it in the future. So we've covered off what the rent increase might look like, whether they can do it at a future date. When it comes to exercising an option, which is what we spoke about a few weeks ago, your lease should also provide for what happens to the rent on an exercise of option. So again, it might be one of those three options, being fixed percentage, CPI, or market rent. Typically, it is market rent, and that is because options are exercised, every 5 years, every 10 years, every 3 years, whatever it is. And the landlord uses that as an opportunity to review the state of the market to determine whether the rent for the premises is appropriate. Now, market rent increases can really go one of two ways. Parties, being the landlord and the tenant, may agree to what the market rent is. They might have a good feeling of that and they might have a solid relationship and can just agree. In other circumstances, the landlord puts forward a market rent review, which is unsuitable and untenable for the tenant. So, what happens in those circumstances is, again, set out in your lease and possibly also set out in the legislation which governs your leasing arrangement. But typically, you can go to a third party valuer to determine the market rent. Now, this is a long process. It can also be a costly process, and it is possible it'll also end up in a determination in court. So, if possible, you want to firstly avoid market rent reviews, but that is not really possible. And secondly, you want to get to a position where you can try and agree on the market rent with your landlord. So, that is also difficult, and you can take some comfort from whatever is contained in your lease and also the legislation which governs your lease. This point also highlights the need to be really careful and detailed when you are negotiating your lease. Whilst the market rent review or the exercise of option might seem a long way away at that point in time, negotiating properly and to make sure you're covered at the outset of when you're entering into the lease is really important. So, having explained the rent review mechanisms, what happens each year, what happens on an exercise of option, we then look at what happens when your lease actually expires. So that means the term of your lease is up, there's no options left, but of course you want to stay in your premises rather than, go through an upheaval and try to find somewhere else and moving. And for pharmacies, moving is not as simple as moving. There is, of course, regulatory processes that you need to go through. So when your lease is up or it has expired, hopefully there comes a point prior to the expiry date where the landlord might come to you and try and gauge whether you want to stay. Alternatively, you might approach the landlord to see if they're willing to offer you a new lease. This is where, I guess, the bargaining power is in favour of the landlord, because they are the ones at this point in time who can dictate the rent for the premises. And as a tenant, you don't want to move. So I guess you're in the weaker position and in the hands of the landlord. So coming back to the original question of can a landlord force a rent increase? When it comes to negotiating a new lease, whether you're entering into it for the first time or your lease has expired and it's time to negotiate a new lease, the landlord really can determine the rent that they wish to charge for that premises at that point in time. So that can be any figure. Now, of course, if they're going to insist on a high rent amount or an unreasonable rent amount, chances are they're going to have difficulty finding a tenant. But can a landlord force a rent increase? Well, the answer is during the term of the lease, yes, but in accordance with the terms of the lease and the legislation. And at the expiry of a lease and entering into a new lease, yes, they can force a rent increase. So what do you do about that? Well, if you are finding that you've come to the end of a lease and your landlord has put forward an unfair rent amount or a significant hike in your rent amount, of course, you can leave, and that, as I said, is easier said than done for some businesses, but it is an option all the same. So that's option one. Option two is, of course, try and negotiate, gather your evidence as to what reasonable rent will be. Option three is to potentially get a third party involved to determine what the market rent is and hopefully try to negotiate. But as I said, the bad news here is that when it does come time to enter into a new lease, you really are in the hands of the landlord. So it is worth making sure you have solid advice at that point and that you know your rights at law. Hopefully that helps. Look forward to chatting to you again next week.